This happened to me 7 years ago. I'm 20 now. My parents were away from home for a family emergency. I am the only child, and whenever my parents left, I stayed home, and I usually didn't get too scared. It was the third night by myself, and I was playing video games and eating junk food. Then I hear a loud knock on the door. I was wondering who could be knocking on someone's door at a late time like this. I could see a man peeping through the small glass windows surrounding the door. I could hear that he was yelling, "I'm really hurt. Please, let me come in." I said, "What's wrong?" He said he had broken his foot. This seemed kind of weird to me. I asked how he broke his foot, and he told me that he was taking a walk around the neighborhood and had tripped. Now he was begging me and screaming, telling me that if he gets really hurt, he's going to sue me for not helping him. I told him that I would call an ambulance for him and told him to wait outside. After I said that, he said, "If you don't let me in, I'll slit your throat and cut all your body parts in half." I grabbed my dad's shotgun that he keeps on the highest shelf in the kitchen, and then I grabbed the phone to call the police. I told the man the police are on their way. He told me they wouldn't make it in time. Now he was trying to bust open my dining room window. By the way he was hitting it, it looked like it was about to break. I quickly ran upstairs into my room and decided to hide under my bed. I called the cops, and the operator told me they would be there in a couple of minutes. As soon as the operator said that, I heard the window break. I could now hear him checking all the rooms downstairs. Then I heard him coming up the stairs. First, he checked my parents' bedroom and the closet. Then I heard him trying to open my door. I gripped the shotgun tightly in my hand and waited for him to break down the door. He was now kicking as hard as he could. In just a couple of hits, he knocked it down. I could see his feet as he tried to open the closet door in my room, which I had locked on purpose to confuse him. He said, "I know you're in there." I was wondering if I should shoot him in the leg or try to sneak past him, but I wouldn't be able to sneak out without making some kind of noise. At that moment, I stupidly forgot that I was under the bed and went to stand up. I hit my head, making a very loud noise. The man quickly turned around. "Oh, trying to get smart with me, huh?" Then I heard the sirens. He said, "You got lucky this time, but you won't the next." He tried to run quickly out of my room, but I grabbed his right foot, making him fall hard on the ground. I was holding it with all my might as I heard the police rushing up the stairs. They grabbed him. I quickly explained everything to the police. Apparently, they found the man's van parked in front of my house. He had many sharp knives, duct tape, a camera, and some rope. I can't imagine what he would have done to me if I hadn't thought to lock that closet door. Okay, my name is Jason, and this is what happened when I was about 16. I live in West Virginia, where there's mountains all around, so I grew up in the woods, hunting, camping, riding ATVs. One day, me and two of my friends Brian and Jesse went out on our ATVs to find a place to camp that upcoming weekend with our girlfriends. We went pretty deep in the woods to try and find the best spot we could. We were probably 5 or 6 miles in when we finally found this little lake. It was perfect. We got off and checked everything out to make sure it wasn't private property or anything, but there were no signs and not a house around for miles. "This is it," Jesse said, and we all agreed. So we got back on our four-wheelers and headed back, knowing that the coming Saturday was going to be a night to remember, which ended up being true, but what we didn't know was that it would also be the worst night of our lives. The next day, we loaded up all of our gear. Fishing poles, tents, sleeping bags. We made sure we had everything we needed to make it a fun night, along with some booze. We all met up around 11 o'clock and headed out. When we got to the lake, We quickly put up the tents and got some firewood ready. All the girls loved it, except for Kat, Brian's girlfriend. She said she felt uneasy, but we just figured it was because she'd never been camping before. So we started fishing and swimming and drinking, but Kat just kept looking around and refused to join in the fun. Finally, it started to get dark, so we started a fire and made some hot dogs. We all sat around the fire, telling scary stories. Then, at about 11:30, Jesse's girlfriend Samantha said she had to pee and asked Kat to come with her. They were gone for maybe 4 minutes when suddenly they came running back, saying that Kat saw something behind a tree watching them. I grabbed my 9mm and went with Jesse to check it out, but didn't find anything, so we thought the scary campfire stories just freaked them out. We arrived back at the campsite and told them that we didn't find anything, but Kat insisted that we were wrong and that we all needed to leave. We eventually calmed her down, and after about 30 minutes, we were all ready to lay down in our tents and go to sleep. Looking back now, I wish we would have left right then and there. I was lying down with my girlfriend Lindsay in our tent. About an hour went by, and I was just listening to the sounds of the woods, when suddenly, I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of the others, but then I realized whoever it was out there was trying to walk quietly. The footsteps stopped at my tent door, and I started to freak out inside. They stood there for at least 3 minutes, and then I saw the zipper start to slowly move. I started to reach for my gun when I suddenly realized that I'd left it in my bag by the campfire. So stupid. The zipper continued to move about 6 more inches when Lindsay coughed, and it stopped. She was still asleep and had no idea that someone or something was trying to sneak into our tent. I heard nothing for about 5 more minutes. Then I could clearly hear footsteps quietly sneaking away from the tent. I couldn't move. I was terrified, and all I could do was stay quiet and hope that they did not come back. 30 silent minutes passed, when all of a sudden, the most crazy, evil-sounding scream I've ever heard bellowed from the next tent over. Then Brian and Kat started screaming, "No! Please, no!" I jumped up and bolted out of the tent, with Lindsay now wide awake. I ran for my bag and grabbed my gun. I looked over at their tent, and what I saw still haunts my dreams to this day. A pale, humanoid-like creature with long, white arms and long claws at the ends of its thin fingers was taking chunks out of Brian as it bit into his flesh. I fired my gun, and the creature looked up at me, its yellow eyes piercing into my soul. I was shaking uncontrollably as it started galloping towards us. I fired at it again, and it took off into the woods, screaming that god-awful scream. We quickly ran up to Brian and Kat's tent, but it was too late. They were both torn up. We couldn't even tell who was who. The girls were crying, and we all felt like we were in a nightmare. I scanned the woods, hoping whatever it was didn't come back. Jesse and the girls were all huddled up as we made our way to the ATVs. When we got to the ATVs, I realized that the keys were still in the tent in my pants pocket. We heard the scream again. I ran as fast as I could back to the tent and quickly snatched the keys. As I turned to run back, there it was, bounding out of the woods and barreling right toward me. I raised the gun and started firing again. I must have hit it because it yelped and screamed and turned to run back into the woods for the last time. I ran back to the ATVs and we rode out of there so fast, I'm surprised we didn't crash and kill ourselves. We immediately went to the cops and told them everything that happened. They decided to go to the campsite and bring us along. By this time, it was light out. When we arrived, everything was destroyed. The tents were ripped up and stuff was thrown everywhere. They took me to Brian's tent, and although there was blood everywhere, there were no bodies. "Where are they?" the cop said. I replied, "I don't know. They were here when we left, but that thing must have taken them." The cops started saying that it looked like a bear did this. They claimed we were drunk and must have been mistaken about what we had seen. I know what I saw, and whatever it was, it didn't come close to resembling a bear. It's been over 10 years since this incident, and Brian and Kat's bodies have never been found. It was officially reported as a black bear attack. I never talked about it to anyone until now. Jesse and Sam got married and moved to Florida. Lindsay moved too, and we broke up not long after that night. What still gets me is whatever that thing was, it tried to get into our tent first. But thankfully, Lindsay coughed, and it left. A cough saved my life. This happened to me on a crisp autumn morning while walking to my bus stop. I played the cello in my high school orchestra and had signed up that day to play in a school festival, so I happened to be a bit dolled up at the time. Makeup, a nice twisted hairdo, a floor-length black dress, and a pair of shiny black suede shoes. I said goodbye to my family as I rushed out the door, binder in arm and backpack in tow. When I got past the edge of my lot, a white, unmarked delivery van without a license plate drove past me and slowed down for a moment, as if the driver was looking at something. I quickened my pace as I watched the van drive to the end of my cul-de-sac and turn around. I noticed that the van was hanging back a ways and going very slowly. I thought, okay, this is creepy, and walked even faster. Then, the unthinkable happened. I tripped over my dress and my binder went flying out in front of me, spilling some of its contents. I heard the van speed up behind me as I scrambled to pick everything up with my bloody hands and run away. But it was too late. The van had caught up to me. The driver rolled down his window. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride to school?" He looked to be mid-30s, had ear-length reddish-brown hair, brown eyes, and a skinny build. His eyes were bloodshot, and his movements were very fast, as if he was tweaking out on something. "I'm fine," I said. "Just leave me alone." "Are you sure you don't want to ride?" he called as I walked away. "Yes, I'm sure. Now stop bothering me before I call the police," I exclaimed as I tried to run away. Thankfully, my dad's friend was working in his front yard and came to my aid when he realized that I was in trouble. The creep then tried to convince my dad's friend that he was just trying to help me, but seeing how distressed I was, plus the fact that he kept following me, my dad's friend didn't buy it. He told me to run inside and get washed up while he called the police. As I did so, the creep tried to get out of his van and follow me, but my dad's friend slammed the door shut, saying, "If you get out of this van, I will beat your sorry ass. You need to leave, now." The van finally pulled away. I continued to walk towards my bus stop, and my dad's friend agreed to watch me from his house until the bus arrived. When I reached the stop, there was another girl waiting for the bus, which brought me some comfort. But the creep had the nerve to come back. When he drove by the second time, I ran for the nearest ditch and started sobbing. I was scared for my life. The other girl at the stop ran over to me, asking what was wrong, and I told her what had just happened. She stayed there with me until my dad's friend raced over in his truck. We waited until the bus came to make sure that the other students at the bus stop got on safely. Once I got to school, I told the campus police officer what happened and tearfully gave him the best description of the creep and his vehicle that I could. Thankfully, he was caught later that day, and I thanked the campus police officer profusely. Turns out, the creep had been living in my neighborhood for about a year. He could have been watching me for that long, and I didn't even know it. I'm currently 14 years old, and this happened to my best friends and I about 3 or 4 years ago. It was my friend Anna's birthday. She had invited me and our friend Sandy to go to the school park and hang out. We thought it sounded fun, so we went. We were goofing off at the edge of the woods when we stumbled upon a trail we'd never seen before. Being the troublemakers we were, and still are, we decided to see where it led to. Sandy was the most reckless, so she led the way. Anna and I took it a bit slower, not knowing what we might find on the path ahead. After about 5 minutes of walking, the path came to a small bend. We followed the bend and came upon a small stream, which was positioned just below the opening of one of those old underground pipes running underneath the school park. It looked like the opening was large enough to where we could fully stand up if we went inside. I suddenly remembered some of the things the older school kids would tell us about these pipes. The one that scared me the most was the legend of the Pipe Man. The Pipe Man was said to live in the pipe, and anytime he got hungry, he would go and kidnap little girls, kill them, and eat them. He would leave whatever was left of their bodies near the train tracks that ran through town. So, of course, me, being the scared little girl that I was, became very uneasy. Sandy and Anna, however, wanted to see what was inside the pipe. They eventually convinced me to go in there with them, and we entered the pipe together. When we were in about 3 or 4 feet, it got dark, and we couldn't see. The smell was so bad that we started gagging and decided that we had to leave. We were all really curious about what was in the pipe though, so we decided to come back the next morning, but this time armed with masks. So, as we left the trailhead, Anna took off her hat and placed it on the ground to mark our spot. The next morning when we got to the park, we searched for Anna's hat, but it was gone. We assumed some kids must have taken it. Luckily, we still managed to find the trail and started down the path once more. We couldn't hold our excitement, or our fear for that matter, as we approached the bend. We donned our masks, turned on our flashlights, and once more entered the pipe. We had ventured pretty far down the pipe when things started getting weird. We could no longer see the opening of the pipe, and we were now discovering what we assumed to be animal bones, although Anna and I also kept the thought of the Pipe Man in the back of our heads. Sandy walked about 15 more feet ahead before stopping and screaming. Anna and I quickly ran up to her. We looked at what she was pointing at, and we could not believe our eyes. It was Anna's hat. Her hat was way down in the pipeline and covered in this red liquid. We ran out of there faster than we'd ever moved before, leaving her hat behind. We eventually made it out of the pipe, panting and gasping for breath. Never in my life have I been so scared. But the story doesn't end there. Before we even started back up the trail, we heard a branch snapping behind us. I turned around and saw a tall, very dirty-looking man with messy, tangled hair. We sprinted up the trail without hesitation. As far as we knew, our worst fear had come to fruition. The Pipe Man was real. We could have been his next meal, but we were lucky enough to make it out alive with nothing but some minor bumps and scratches. We've never told anyone about this experience. The park has since been torn down, but the trail remains. None of us will ever go down there again. So, Pipe Man, if you're hearing this, I hope we never meet again. I'm a 16-year-old male, and I used to be a bit skeptical about all things paranormal until one weekend at an abandoned house. I was with my 2 best friends at the time, Delaney and Julia. We were home alone and bored at Delaney's house with nothing to do. I can't remember whose idea it was, but one of us had the idea to drive around some of the old dirt roads and check out abandoned buildings. There are a lot of abandoned places around where we live. It's pretty far out in the country, surrounded by woods and farmland. First, we went to 2 old tobacco houses, took a few pictures, and just sort of goofed off. We got back on the road and eventually came across an old, unkempt driveway. Keep in mind, hardly anyone lives on this road. We decided to drive down the driveway despite Julia saying we shouldn't. She said it didn't feel right to her, not because it would be trespassing, but because she had extremely bad vibes about that place. However, Delaney and I insisted. We started driving and realized that it went pretty far back into the woods. This is where weird things started to happen. We parked the truck in a little clearing and noticed an abandoned house in the distance. But before we could get out of the truck, the front sensor started beeping like crazy, followed by the one in the rear. It was as if someone had walked around the truck. The weird thing is that we were parked in a clearing, so there was seemingly nothing to trigger the sensors. Delaney and Julia were kind of freaked out, but I decided to just ignore it. We all got out of the truck and started walking towards the house. I was walking in the front, showing off and acting fearless. And I really wasn't that scared until I saw her. A woman with dingy-looking hair and a colonial-style dress peering around the corner of the house. She looked at me and just put her finger up to her lips as if to shush me. The feeling I had is almost indescribable. Imagine feeling as if all sense of safety and protection is gone and you don't feel happy at all. My heart felt like it stopped. I started crying and I was so scared. I knew she wasn't human. I don't know how, but I just knew. I turned around to my friends and screamed, "Run!" and started sprinting back to the truck. Somehow, my phone flew out of my pocket about halfway back to the truck. I decided to ditch it. We eventually made it back. I tried to open it, but it was locked. Delaney reached for her keys, but they were gone, and so was Julia's phone. It's as if whatever that thing was trying to keep us there. Delaney ran back and picked up mine and Julia's phone, as well as her keys. We got in the truck and floored it out of there. You might think it's just coincidental that we dropped all of our things, but honestly, they were all shoved down so deep in our pockets that it didn't make sense for them to just fall out on their own like that. Later that night at the house, we were all discussing what we had just experienced, but my friends didn't even see the woman. I was afraid they didn't believe me, but Julia reassured me that the horrified look on my face was proof enough for her to run as well. We later found out that there had been several sightings of ghosts on that exact same road, made by workers at Fort Pickett, a nearby military facility. Back when I was a freshman in high school, I was a part of the school choir. To be honest, I wasn't the best singer, and I only joined for the benefit of skipping class. The skipping class part was great and all, but staying late for practice was kind of a downside. One day, we had to practice near the school's botanical garden because the space where we usually practice was occupied. Some of the members of the choir were hesitant about practicing near the gardens because of the scary stories surrounding the place. Personally, I just wanted practice to be over. We practiced until about 8 or 9 p.m. Around this time, there were only 2 gates that would be open if you wanted to leave the school. The college gate, which was pretty far away, and the track and field gate, which was much closer, but you had to pass through the gardens to get there. Being lazy, I decided to take the shortest route, while everyone else went the other way. Personally, I think any place can feel creepy if it's dark enough, so I wasn't too worried. After walking for a while, I took out my phone and called my parents. It rang once and was promptly answered. I talked into the phone, telling my parents where to pick me up. But no answer. I hung up and called again. Same thing, no answer. I called for the 3rd time and asked them to pick me up, almost shouting into the phone for an answer, but still, nothing. Finally, I gave up and decided to send them a text. After walking through the garden for about a couple more minutes, I finally reached my pickup destination without incident. Admittedly, it was a creepy walk, and I was kind of relieved that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. After about 15 minutes, my parents finally arrived, but something was off. The car pulled up in front of me, and my parents got out frantically. They asked if I was okay with worried expressions on their faces. I said that I was fine. They told me that they got my calls. I asked them what they had heard. They said that they heard my voice over the phone saying, "Help me," repeatedly, over and over again. I don't usually do this, but this has traumatized me for a while, so I'm gonna get it out of my system. When I was 16 years old, I lived in a rural area in England in a small village, if you could call it that. It was really nothing more than a few houses with a small store. The closest school was in the next town over, and that was half an hour away, so every morning I would have to get up at 6 a.m. to catch the bus. But it wasn't all bad, because I had two great friends around my age, Connor and Courtney. We would get on the bus together every morning and hang out around the town on the weekends. Anyway, at the time this story takes place, I had a cat named King, which I had gotten for my 15th birthday. He was a huge white cat with green eyes and an attitude. I loved that cat so much. So when he went missing, it messed me up pretty bad. I spent weeks crying my eyes out waiting for him to come home, but he never did. Soon, news began to spread that a lot of the neighbors' cats had actually been disappearing as well. And since none of them had been found dead in the road, townsfolk assumed that a fox was to blame for the disappearances. One weekend, Connor, Courtney, and I had decided that we were bored of hanging around Courtney's place, so we decided to go exploring. We liked to walk along the back roads until we were completely lost, and then try to find our way back. It was stupid, but good fun. We were going down a back road that we'd never been down before when we came across a path leading off the main road. It was unkempt and looked like nobody had used it for years. We went down the path, excited to see where it led, and we were even more excited when we found an old rundown house at the end. The front door was wide open and barely standing. Connor carefully moved it aside as we crept in. The smell was putrid, and I'm pretty sure I retched a little. Everything was filthy and falling apart. Just being there gave me a weird, sick feeling in my stomach, like something didn't feel right. Courtney must have felt it too, because she immediately began complaining that we should leave. And I would have left if I hadn't been trying to impress Connor, who, at the time, I had a huge crush on. So instead of leaving, Connor and I teased her until she agreed to come with us through the rest of the house. We went through what looked to be a living room, but it was covered in dirt and piles of trash. The smell worsened as we made our way to the bottom of the stairs. Courtney made it clear that she did not want to go up there, but when we told her to wait for us at the bottom of the stairs, she made it even clearer that she didn't want to do that more. So we all went up together, Courtney clinging to my arm, and me clinging to Connor, who took the lead. At the top of the stairs, there was a corridor with about 3 rooms. It was just as filthy as the downstairs area, and the smell was 10 times worse. We piled into the first room we came across, and Connor froze. I looked over his shoulder and nearly puked. The room was full of the decomposing bodies of what looked to be cats, all piled up against the walls. The stench was horrendous. I heard Connor whisper, "Oh no," under his breath. Then, from the corner of the room, came something flying through the air rapidly. It hit Connor straight in the chest and fell to the floor. It was a decaying cat corpse, followed by a deranged scream of, "Get out!" And then, from the same corner stumbled a filthy old man staggering towards us. We immediately got the hell out of there. I don't remember much about it, other than me and Courtney screaming our heads off and almost tripping over one of the door frames on our way out. We ran until we couldn't run anymore. Luckily, we remembered our way back, but it took us at least 30 minutes to get back home, and in that time, we speed walked as fast as we could, jumping at every sound. We finally made it back and ran to Courtney's house. We hurriedly explained to Courtney's parents what happened, and they called the police. The police came by a couple of hours later and took statements. Connor told me that they went to the house a few days later and said that the cats were still there, but there was no sign of the man. When I was visiting my mother earlier this month, my boyfriend and I went to check out the house, but it had been knocked down. I have no idea what that man was doing there that day, or if he had killed all those cats, but I have a feeling that my cat was in there somewhere, and it still makes me sick to this day. There are some messed up people in the world. Okay, so this is my first official post, but I have to share this story. It happened about 3 years ago. I live in the United States. I was a 23-year-old male college student living in a low-income neighborhood when this occurred. About 5 minutes after my Pizza Hut shift one night, I decided to walk across the street to buy some beer at my local liquor store. As the cashier was handing me my bag, a short and muffled, high-pitched scream reverberated throughout the store, coming from outside. I distinctly remember how pitiful it sounded. The cashier and I made that certain eye contact where you're both just like, "What the hell?" After a brief silence, he just shrugged his shoulders and told me to be careful getting home. I nodded my head and left. I know it seems like we may have underreacted, but honestly, you see and hear a lot of crazy things in this area, especially at night. So, in addition to not wanting to get mixed up in any trouble, you don't just call the cops over what could be nothing, especially a random scream. I opened the liquor store door slightly and looked around outside. After hearing and seeing nothing but traffic for about 15 seconds, I decided to start walking home, head down, but eyes and ears alert. As soon as I rounded the liquor store corner, I was greeted by an obviously intoxicated, short and stocky man with a scratched-up face and a really stretched-out shirt. Assuming he was just one of the several drunks that lived in the dense patch of forest behind the store, I completely disregarded him and continued walking. But something about his behavior caught my attention. He looked extremely nervous, as if he were up to something. I could also hear a faint, almost inaudible, gurgle-like sound coming from within the trees. Immediately, I began to suspect that he had something to do with the scream I'd heard just minutes before. Upon making eye contact, he caught on fast that I suspected him. "How are you?" he awkwardly asked me, smiling way too much and motioning for me to follow him into the darkness behind the store. I pretty much told him to screw off and continued walking home at a much faster pace now. I began wondering what the hell that noise was coming from in the woods and why the man was acting so shady. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the sound was just an old pipe or drain nearby. Maybe he was just really drunk and didn't want me to call the cops on him for public intoxication or something like that. But now, I wish with everything in me that I would have called the police right then and there. Because about 5 minutes later, while walking down a particularly dark and isolated stretch of road about a half a mile away from my apartment complex, out of nowhere, the man I had just seen burst through some shrubbery behind me, wielding a machete. That's right, a machete. Honestly, you can't make this stuff up. I immediately went into panic mode, threw my beers at him, and began running as fast as my legs would carry me toward my apartment building, hoping I had enough strength left within me to make it. I now realize I should have ran back toward the store, as it was closer. He was initially so close behind me, I swear I could hear the blade cutting the air as he swung at me from behind. I honestly expected a machete blow to the neck or head at any second. The worst, most gruesome thoughts of me being murdered began to fill my mind. Would I trip, only to have my arm hacked off right before my eyes? Or would I be halfway decapitated mid-stride, falling hard and bleeding out as other parts of my body were cut away? Tears began to fill my eyes at the thought of how my family would feel knowing I was hacked to death, bleeding out on the side of a dark road, alone. I began to scream, half out of desperation to live, the other half out of fear of not wanting to die such a horrible death. I eventually made it home. Some part of me knew I'd lost the guy way before getting there, but my fear and adrenaline refused to let me stop running. I collapsed as soon as I made it inside. I remember all I could think about was how the hell I didn't hear him getting that close to me, especially with him being under the influence and me being sober. Needless to say, after double-checking all the doors and windows, I fell into a paranoid sleep while gripping a kitchen knife. The next day, I found out that a young teenage girl had been killed behind the store. Her body was dumped not far from where it happened, and as far as I know, the guy has never been caught. I am 120% sure that the man's scratched face and stretched shirt were evidence of the poor girl's futile attempt to fight off her killer, and he must have wanted to kill me too because he thought that I was a witness. If I had called the police right then and there, would he have been caught? I try to remind myself that things played out the way they did, and that I can't change the past. So, Michael Myers, machete-wielding killer, let's never meet ever again. When I was young, in the 60s, we lived in an old house built before the Civil War. It was up in Oldham County, Kentucky, in an area known as the Devil's Backbone on Dawkins Road. I was around 12 years old and had an encounter I will never forget. One night, I was unable to sleep and was lying on my side when I got a very uncomfortable feeling. I turned on my back and saw a young man with dark hair and a mustache staring at me from the foot of the bed. He was wearing clothing from the 1800s. I looked at him for a while before I lost my nerve and ducked under the covers. When I looked back up, he was gone. Several weeks later, I was upstairs in my brother's room, home alone. Suddenly, someone loudly ran up the steps to the door. I opened it, only to find a cold breeze. I decided to leave the house until everyone else got home. Sometime later, I was in town with my dad. We met an old man that said he had lived in that house when he was a boy. He said the house was haunted and that a young musician had hung himself from the second-story window, which happened to be my brother's room. It was in the middle of April 2010, and my unit was back in the States from Afghanistan. We were demobilizing at Camp Shelby. Everything had been going well. The days were relaxed, and I was actually getting full night's sleep. And by full, I mean about 4 to 5 hours compared to the 0 to 2 hours that I was getting downrange. But there was this one night I woke up in the middle of the night. It seemed to be around 2 or 3 in the morning. I felt that I was awakened by something other than just my usual insomnia. I believe it was a feeling that something was about to happen, but I didn't know what. I looked around the barracks, and I didn't see anything, but the feeling was still there. I stayed awake for a few more minutes, scanning the room before starting to drift back to sleep. As soon as I fell back to sleep, from out of nowhere I felt this insane amount of pressure on my chest and saw a man with a pale face and black combed-over hair wearing Vietnam-era Class A's pushing down on my chest. My first thought was, what the hell? I was paralyzed, literally, I couldn't feel anything below my waist. I had this tight knot in my throat that kept me from being able to yell out or say anything. My legs had this numb feeling, and no matter what I tried, I couldn't move them. It took me a second to realize what was happening, and when I did, I freaked out. All I was able to do was just stare at this man holding me down, making it hard for me to breathe. He finally let off my chest and began to violently shake me, grabbing me by the shoulders, although I wasn't actually moving. As he was shaking me, he started yelling something, but it was inaudible, mouth just moving, but no words coming out. At this point, the fear began to subside and was being replaced with pure anger. I looked at him and mouthed the words, "Get off." His maniacal demeanor slowly subsided and he stopped and looked at me with confusion on his face. I then mouthed the words, "Get the hell off me." I began looking around just to see if anyone else was awake and seeing this, but there was no one. No one that I could see anyway. So after mouthing the words, the ghost stood up, walked to the foot of my bunk, stared at me for a few seconds with his head cocked to one side, turned, and faded through a wall. After a minute, I pushed the blankets off, which were completely drenched in sweat. The silence was horrible after that. All the small sounds inside the barracks were amplified. My guard was up, and there was no possibility of any more sleep that night. I've only told this to my wife, but only because she has had her own encounters with spirits. I still think about it now and then, chalking it up to fatigue or a nightmare, a very vivid and realistic nightmare. Let's start with a little backstory. I live in a really small town in Finland. Roughly 300 people live in our town, mostly workers of nearby factories. In the summertime, our town is busy with tourists and other travelers, but this story took place in the winter, and in the winter, it's a total ghost town. I work in our town's pub as a bartender, and despite the quiet winters, we keep the pub open for people to have a place to spend time and not feel lonely. It was a normal Friday, quiet and cold. I had a couple of local customers playing some tunes from the jukebox and getting hammered as I kept the fire burning in the fireplace. Winter had just started, and we were discussing when it would start to get really snowy. The night went well, and not so surprisingly, probably 1 hour before closing, it started to snow heavily. I closed the pub, cleaned up, and started to do paperwork. Our pub closes at 2 a.m. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard a really loud banging coming from the staff door. It was like someone was having a freaking life or death emergency. I didn't know what or who it was, but I went closer to the door and I heard a man's voice screaming, "Please help me! Open the door! Is there someone there?" I wondered if it could be a trick to get me to open the door so someone could rob our pub. But still, I thought it could also be someone in real danger, being chased by some wild animal or something. I decided to take my trusty baseball bat that I keep behind the counter and went to open the door. The man literally steamrolled me and entered the bar as I quickly closed the door behind him. I didn't want anything else to come in. I recognized the man as one of the locals. He would never usually come to our bar, but I knew that he had a really bad alcohol problem. I also noticed that he didn't have shoes, gloves, or a hat, and he was obviously freezing. He started to speak so fast that I couldn't understand anything. I told him to slow down. Then he said this, "Rubber faces! Rubber faces! They're chasing me! Please help me!" Of course, I thought the guy was drunk as hell, but still, something in his eyes told me that he was really scared for his life, and it gave me the creeps. I couldn't see outside very well because it was still snowing heavily, and we don't have street lights. I happened to know a woman who was a very good friend of this poor guy, and decided to try calling her. She answered, and I told her that I was sorry to call this late, but that her friend was pretty messed up at the bar right now and he needed to be picked up. She told me that she would come. I hung up, and the guy continued to rock back and forth in his chair, mumbling about the rubber faces and how they would hunt him down when the woman came to pick him up. Before the call disconnected, the woman had told me that her friend had pretty strong medication and he probably just hadn't taken it yet. Happy that the situation was basically taken care of, I finished the paperwork and got ready to go home. I was still feeling a little nervous though, because the apartments where this guy lived happened to be close to my house. When I finally left the pub, I decided to take the bat and the flashlight with me because it was still dark as hell. When I reached the road next to the pub, I was watching my surroundings very closely, observing the surrounding trees. Then, it happened. I noticed the footprints in the snow. My heart skipped a beat and I started to panic. There were normal footprints that led to our pub, and then there were 3 distorted pairs of footprints that looked like they had been following the first ones. Suddenly, I heard the loud sound of snapping branches from the forest nearby, and I immediately started to run like the wind. I haven't ran that fast in a long time. I ran the whole way home and never looked back. This story still scares the crap out of me. I still don't know what those footprints meant and what was lurking in the forest, but I know that something wasn't right that night, and I'm happy that I never met whatever it was that made those last 3 pairs of footprints. In 1985, my uncle worked for a cleaning company where he would clean carpets in people's houses in and around Santa Cruz. He would constantly go to the houses alone. One day, my uncle got a phone call to go over and clean a house outside of Santa Cruz, but his partner couldn't go with him this time because he had things to do. His partner warned him about these private clubs up in the mountains around Santa Cruz because he'd heard that these exclusive clubs were hosts to a lot of strange and ominous things. So this time, my uncle would have to go alone. He was very nervous and fearful going by himself. He drove up these winding roads that were cast in shadow by the canopies of the redwood trees. During his drive, my uncle was thinking about all the things that his colleague had said. He was getting more scared as he got closer to his destination. Once he arrived there was a massive gate that had a security code that he had to enter in order to get in. The driveway was even longer than the road he was traveling on. Finally, at the end of the long driveway, there stood a concrete lodge. The strange part was there was nobody there, not even any cars. My uncle became more nervous as he approached the front doors. They were large wooden doors that had strange symbols and carvings etched into them. But this is the part that chills me to the bone and makes my skin crawl. When he entered the lodge, he encountered a massive hall with a stone altar in the center and a few blood-red candles resting on top of it that were lit. There were no chairs, no decorations, just the stone altar sitting in the middle of the hall. He got a sickening feeling in his stomach. My uncle said he would rather get fired than stay there any longer. He ran back to the van and floored it out of there. After that, he quit the job. The lodge members wanted him to go up there again, but a month after he quit, he heard something on the news about what was going on at that lodge. The people who lived there were devil worshippers and did vampirism rituals where they would constantly lure people up to the lodge and do God knows what to them. The fact is, if my uncle wasn't aware of his surroundings, he would have ended up as a sacrificial victim. And thank goodness that he decided to get out of there. When I was about 6, my aunt was babysitting me, and she took me to the mall with her. We were in the food court, and she got up to use the restroom. She told me to stay put. When she left, A guy who looked to be in his 30s approached me and started talking to me. I forgot exactly what he said, as this happened a long time ago, but it was something along the lines of, "Where's your parents? Are you lost?" And when I told him my aunt was in the bathroom, he smiled and asked me if I wanted to hang out with him while I waited for her to get back. In my 6-year-old mind, nothing seemed wrong about this. I said yes, and he held out his hand for me to take. Luckily, it was at that exact moment that my aunt saw him and started sprinting towards us. As soon as he saw her, he got a scared look on his face, let go of my hand, and took off. I'm glad that my aunt got there in time, or who knows what would have happened. This happened just yesterday, when me and my best friend were hanging out at my house in the suburbs, as we normally do. We were really bored, so we decided to take a relaxing walk around the neighborhood. Or so we thought. Let me tell you about my block. There's a hospital nearby, and my neighborhood has a history of drug and alcohol-related incidents, but they don't happen very often. Nevertheless, it's still kind of dodgy. So, me and my friend were just talking and messing around while we walked, having a blast in each other's company. We turned the corner to walk down a two-way street with houses on one side and a park area on the other. We walked on a foot trail through the park and back towards my house in silence, just taking in the scenery. But when we were about 150 feet away from my house, I heard a loud, singular footstep from behind us. I turned around, expecting to see a young teenager or an elderly person, as those are the types of people we would usually see walking along these trails in my area. But what I actually saw will be burned into the back of my mind for years. There was a man. He had a skinny figure and fierce eyes. He wore a dark hoodie and jeans, and he was looking directly at me with this deeply unsettling glare. But the worst part was his aggressive and unnatural limp as he quickly approached us. It looked so bizarre, like he was possessed, and he was grinning at me with the creepiest, most twisted smile I'd ever seen in my life. His head was cocked to one side, and his teeth were disgustingly yellow. He looked psychotic and like he wanted to harm us in the most brutal way imaginable. I whipped back around and told my friend to start quickly walking back to the house because running might make the man angry and run after us. I didn't know if he was high or drunk or whatever. My friend, not having yet seen the man, finally turned around and almost screamed. I've never seen anyone make that kind of face before in my life. I grabbed her wrist and we sped up to reach home. As we neared my house, I turned around and the man was trailing only several feet behind us now, and he was moving quicker with that disturbing, broken limp. If it didn't look unnatural or scary enough to begin with, it sure did now. We are two young teenage girls, and even if we both fought against him, I don't think we would win. We sped up, and it turned into a full-on chase. He continued to pursue us with his fast, demonic limp, and we sped up to keep him from closing the distance between us. We managed to get home safely, and I peeked through the window. The man had slowed down, but was still limping. He then crossed over to the other side of the road. For what reason? I'll never know. He went out of sight, and I closed the curtains, still shaking from the adrenaline. After all that, we went into the kitchen to grab some water. Through the kitchen window, we both saw the man slink back into the park, and never saw him after that. Afterwards, I thought about the whole incident and became even more unsettled. I remember hearing only one footstep behind us. No pattern, just a thump on the ground from a single sneaker. Then it hit me. The man was probably trying to sneak up on us. It gives me anxiety knowing that if I didn't hear that single footstep, or if I didn't turn around, we could have been in serious trouble. Who knows what could have happened?